In a small, quiet town in Texas, the sun was shining brightly through the windows of a fifth-grade classroom. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and old textbooks. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Granger, a strict teacher with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. She prided herself on running a disciplined class, but today, something unusual happened that would change everything. The lesson that day was about World War II heroes. Mrs. Granger had spent nearly an hour talking about soldiers who risked their lives to protect others. She spoke passionately about battles, bravery, and sacrifice. But her tone shifted when she decided to ask the students if they knew anyone personally who had served in the war. One by one, hands went up hesitantly. Most kids mentioned uncles or great-grandfathers who were part of the military, though none could really say what those relatives had done during the war. Then, from the back of the room, a soft voice broke the silence. "My grandpa," said a girl sitting near the window. Her name was Emily Parker, and she wasn't someone who usually spoke much in class, but today she felt compelled to share. Mrs. Granger turned her attention toward Emily, raising an eyebrow. "Your grandpa? What did he do?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. Emily swallowed hard, feeling all eyes on her. He was a big hero," she stammered, clutching her pencil tightly. This response made Mrs. Granger smirk. She crossed her arms over her chest and leaned against the blackboard. "Oh, really?" she said sarcastically. "You know, every child thinks their grandparents are heroes. Do you even have proof?" Emily's cheeks flushed red as whispers filled the room. Some kids giggled nervously while others glanced at each other, unsure how to react. Feeling cornered, Emily tried to defend herself. "It's true," she insisted, her voice trembling. "He saved lives." Mrs. Granger let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Saved lives? That's quite the claim. Are we supposed to believe this without any evidence?" Her words cut deep, making Emily shrink into her seat. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to look away. The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing second. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, Mrs. Granger snapped. In a moment of anger, she walked over to Emily's desk and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the silent classroom, leaving everyone stunned, including Mrs. Granger herself. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. Emily sat frozen, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch her stinging cheek. Her classmates stared wide-eyed, not knowing whether to speak up or stay quiet. Even Mrs. Granger looked shocked by her own actions, though she quickly masked it with defiance. "That'll teach you to lie in my class," she muttered under her breath before turning back to the board. But just as the heavy silence began to suffocate the room, there was a knock at the door. Everyone turned to see who it was. Standing in the doorway was a tall, muscular man with a calm yet commanding presence. His cowboy hat rested low on his forehead, casting a shadow over his face. It took a moment for people to recognize him, but when they did, gasps rippled through the classroom. It was Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist, actor, and former Air Force veteran. He stepped inside, removing his hat politely. "Sorry to interrupt," he said in a deep, steady voice. "I'm here to talk to the kids about real-life heroes." His piercing gaze swept across the room until it landed on Emily, whose tear-streaked face caught his attention immediately. Without missing a beat, Chuck walked straight toward her, ignoring the awkwardness hanging in the air. Kneeling beside her desk, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Emily nodded weakly, still too shaken to speak. Then, looking around the room, Chuck addressed the entire class. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone firm but kind. Nobody dared to answer. Finally, one brave student pointed at Mrs. Granger and blurted out, "She hit Emily because she said her grandpa was a war hero." Chuck's expression darkened slightly as he turned to face the teacher. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that demanded honesty. Mrs. Granger fidgeted uncomfortably, trying to explain herself. She was lying, she protested, weakly. "Kids always think their grandparents are heroes. I was just teaching her a lesson." Chuck studied her for a long moment before turning back to Emily. "Tell me about your grandpa," he encouraged softly. For the first time since the incident, Emily found her voice. Through sniffles, she began recounting her grandfather's story, determined to prove that he truly was a hero. And so, what started as an ordinary school day turned into something extraordinary, a story that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. Little did they know, the truth about Emily's grandpa would soon come to light in ways no one could have imagined. Chuck Norris knelt beside Emily, his calm demeanor putting her somewhat at ease despite the chaos of the moment. His presence alone seemed to fill the room, and even Mrs. Granger, who had been so quick to assert her authority just moments ago, now looked uneasy. Chuck gave Emily a reassuring smile, his eyes soft but focused. "Go ahead," he said gently, encouraging her to continue. "Tell me about your grandpa." Emily hesitated for a second, glancing nervously at Mrs. Granger, who stood stiffly near the blackboard with her arms crossed. The teacher's lips were pressed into a thin line, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like regret or maybe fear. But when Emily turned back to Chuck, she found courage in his steady gaze. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "My grandpa, his name is Samuel Parker," she started, her voice still shaky but growing stronger with each word. "He was in World War II. He parachuted behind enemy lines and he saved a lot of soldiers. People say he's a hero, but he doesn't talk about it much because he says it wasn't about being famous. It was about doing what was right." As Emily spoke, the classroom fell silent. Even the kids who had giggled or whispered earlier now listened intently, their curiosity piqued. Chuck leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed every detail. "He got medals for what he did," Emily continued, her voice rising with pride. "But he keeps them in a box under his bed. He told me once that the real reward was coming home alive and seeing his family again." She paused, then added quietly, almost to herself, "I know he's not lying. I've seen the pictures, and I've heard the stories from other people too." At this point, Mrs. Granger scoffed loudly, clearly unable to hold her tongue any longer. "Pictures?" she said, her tone laced with disbelief. "Anyone can take a picture. That doesn't prove anything." Chuck didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, silently urging her to keep going. Emboldened by his support, Emily dug into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was worn from years of handling, its edges frayed, but the image was clear enough. A young soldier standing alongside several high-ranking officers, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower. "This is him," Emily said, holding up the photo for everyone to see. "That's my grandpa, with General Eisenhower. See? He really was there." The room erupted into murmurs as the students craned their necks to get a better look. Even Mrs. Granger took a step closer, though she tried to mask her interest by pretending to adjust her glasses. Chuck accepted the photo from Emily, studying it carefully. His brow furrowed slightly as he examined the faces in the image, his mind working through memories of his own past. After a long pause, Chuck looked up, his expression serious. "This man," he said, pointing to the figure of Samuel Parker in the photo, "saved my life." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, heads began to turn toward Mrs. Granger, whose face had gone pale. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no sound came out. Chuck stood up, still holding the photograph, and addressed the entire class. "I served in the military myself," he explained, his voice steady and commanding. "And during my research into veteran stories, I discovered something remarkable. Your grandpa, Emily," he said, turning to face her directly, "led a rescue mission that wiped out 2 sniper nests targeting my unit. If it weren't for him, many men, including me, wouldn't have made it home." The weight of his words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed around the classroom as the students processed what they were hearing. Some stared at Emily in awe, while others glanced nervously at Mrs. Granger, whose rigid posture had begun to falter. Her arms dropped to her sides and her fingers twitched anxiously as if searching for something to hold on to. Chuck turned his attention to the teacher, his tone firm, but measured. "You owe this girl, and her grandfather, an apology," he said, simply. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Mrs. Granger stammered, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought she was exaggerating. I didn't mean to." Before she could finish, the classroom door swung open again, interrupting her feeble attempt at justification. Everyone turned to see who it was this time, and the sight that greeted them sent another ripple of shock through the room. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane. His hair was silver, and his face was lined with age, but there was a quiet strength in his bearing that commanded respect. It was Samuel Parker himself, Emily's grandfather. Word had reached him earlier that day about what happened in school. A concerned parent had called to tell him how his granddaughter had been humiliated and struck by her teacher. Without hesitation, Samuel had grabbed his cane and headed straight to the school, determined to set things right. When Emily saw him, she bolted out of her seat and ran into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Samuel hugged her tightly, stroking her hair as he whispered soothing words. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured. "Grandpa's here now." For a moment, the tension in the room melted away as the two embraced. When Emily finally pulled back, tears streaming down her face, Samuel looked around the classroom, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. He spotted Chuck Norris standing nearby, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. Without wasting time, Samuel addressed the class, confirming everything Emily had said. "Yes, I served in the war," he admitted humbly. "But I never wanted anyone to make a fuss about it. What I did back then, it wasn't for glory. It was for the men beside me, the ones who didn't make it home." His words carried a weight that silenced even the most skeptical listener. As he recounted parts of his story, his voice remained steady, though tinged with emotion. He spoke of the dangers he faced, the lives he saved, and the sacrifices he witnessed. Through it all, he emphasized the importance of remembering those who gave everything for freedom. When he finished speaking, the room was utterly still. All eyes were on Mrs. Granger, who now looked like she wished the floor would swallow her whole. Slowly, Samuel approached her, leaning on his cane but standing tall nonetheless. "You may not have believed my granddaughter," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "but that doesn't give you the right to treat her or anyone else with such disrespect. Heroes aren't defined by medals or photographs. They're defined by the truth of their actions and the love they show to others." Mrs. Granger nodded weakly, tears welling up in her own eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I truly am." Samuel accepted her apology with a nod, then turned back to the class. "Remember this day," he told them. "Not because of me, but because of the lesson we can all learn from it. Never be afraid to stand up for the truth and always honor those who came before us." With that, the tension in the room lifted, replaced by a sense of unity and understanding. Chuck Norris stayed behind to share more stories of bravery and patriotism, ensuring that the legacy of heroes like Samuel Parker would live on in the hearts of the next generation. As Samuel Parker stood in the classroom, leaning on his cane but radiating a quiet strength, the students couldn't help but feel awestruck. This wasn't just some distant figure from history books. This was Emily's grandpa, a man who had lived through danger and sacrifice, yet spoke of it with such humility that it made everyone sit up straighter in their seats. His presence filled the room, not because he demanded attention, but because his story carried an undeniable weight. Chuck Norris, still holding the photograph, stepped closer to Samuel. "Sir," Chuck began, his voice full of respect, "I owe you my life." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Samuel glanced at him, recognition flickering in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if piecing together fragments of memory. "I remember that mission," Samuel said after a moment, his tone soft but steady. "It was one of the toughest nights any of us had faced. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and deep behind enemy lines. But we didn't have a choice. We had to act fast." He paused, looking down for a brief second before continuing. There were 2 sniper nests pinning down your unit. If we hadn't taken them out, none of you would have made it back alive. The room was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Samuel's voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, but every word carried the weight of someone who had been there, who had seen things no one should ever have to witness. Yet despite the gravity of what he was saying, there was no trace of pride or boastfulness in his tone, only a deep sense of duty. Emily watched her grandfather intently, her tears drying as she listened. She had heard bits and pieces of his stories before, but never like this. Never in front of so many people. Never with someone like Chuck Norris standing beside him, confirming every word. It was as if the entire world had shifted, and suddenly everyone could see her grandpa for who he truly was, a hero. Samuel turned to address the class again, his gaze sweeping over the sea of young faces. War isn't glamorous, he said, firmly. It's ugly, painful, and heartbreaking. I lost friends, good men who didn't deserve to die. They're the real heroes, not me. All I did was try to keep others safe, just like they tried to do for me. His words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even Mrs. Granger, who had been standing stiffly near the blackboard, seemed moved. Her earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by a look of genuine remorse. She clutched her hands tightly together, her knuckles white, as if trying to hold herself together. Chuck placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, nodding in agreement. That's exactly why we need to honor people like you, he said. Too often we forget the sacrifices made by those who came before us, and when we dismiss their stories or worse, mock them, we lose something important. We lose a piece of our humanity. At that moment, one of the students raised their hand timidly. It was a boy sitting near the front row, his face flushed with curiosity. Mr. Parker, he asked hesitantly, what was the hardest part about being in the war? Samuel took a deep breath, considering the question carefully. The hardest part? He repeated softly. It wasn't the fighting. Believe it or not, that part becomes almost automatic after a while. You focus on surviving, on doing your job. No, the hardest part was leaving behind the ones you love, knowing you might never see them again. He glanced at Emily, his eyes softening. When I left for the war, my daughter Emily's mom was only 5 years old. She didn't understand why I had to go. All she knew was that her daddy was gone, and she cried every night for months. That broke my heart more than anything else. Emily's eyes widened as she realized this was a side of her grandpa she'd never known. Sure, she'd always thought of him as strong and brave, but she hadn't fully grasped the personal cost of his heroism. Now, hearing him talk about missing, his family, about the pain of separation, made her appreciate him even more. Another student spoke up, emboldened by Samuel's openness. Did you ever get scared? A girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel chuckled softly, shaking his head. Of course I got scared, he admitted. Every soldier does, no matter how tough they seem. Fear doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The trick is learning how to push through it, how to focus on the mission instead of the fear. By now, the atmosphere in the classroom had transformed entirely. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable situation had turned into something extraordinary, a lesson far deeper and more meaningful than anything Mrs. Granger could have taught from a textbook. The students were hanging on to Samuel's every word, their minds racing with questions and newfound admiration. Chuck noticed the change, too. Smiling warmly, he turned to the class. You know, folks like Mr. Parker here don't ask for recognition, he said. They don't march around expecting medals or applause. They do what they do because it's the right thing. That's what true bravery looks like. Not loud, flashy acts, but quiet determination. Mrs. Granger, still standing off to the side, finally found the courage to speak. Her voice trembled as she addressed Samuel directly. Mr. Parker, I'm so sorry, she stammered. I judged you and your granddaughter unfairly. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you both terribly. Can you forgive me?" Samuel looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But remember this. Teaching isn't just about facts and figures. It's about inspiring kids to believe in themselves and in the truth. Don't let your doubts overshadow someone else's reality." Tears streamed down Mrs. Granger's face as she nodded, overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude. For the first time since the incident began, she seemed truly humbled. With the tension easing, Chuck decided to lighten the mood a little. Turning to Emily, he grinned. "You know, I think your grandpa deserves a round of applause," he said. Without hesitation, the entire class erupted into cheers, clapping and whistling as Samuel stood there smiling modestly. As the noise settled, Chuck pulled out a small notebook and pen from his pocket. Flipping it open, he scribbled something quickly before tearing out the page and handing it to Emily. "Here," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "This is for you, and for your grandpa." Emily unfolded the paper and read the note aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. "To Emily, never stop telling your grandpa's story. Heroes like him deserve to be remembered." The room fell silent once more, but this time, it was a silence filled with reflection and gratitude. Samuel reached out and patted Emily's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. In that moment, it was clear that something remarkable had happened, not just for Emily and her grandpa, but for everyone in that classroom. With the classroom still buzzing from the emotional exchange, Chuck Norris decided it was time to take things a step further. He could see that the students were fully engaged now, their minds open and eager to learn. This wasn't just about Samuel Parker's story anymore. It was about teaching these kids something bigger, the value of truth, respect, and standing up for what's right. "All right, listen up," Chuck said, raising his voice slightly to get everyone's attention. The room quieted almost instantly, all eyes turning to him. "We've heard an incredible story today, but let's not stop there. Heroes like Mr. Parker aren't just figures from history. They're reminders of the kind of people we should strive to be. So, how about we make sure this lesson sticks?" The students nodded enthusiastically, their curiosity piqued. Even Mrs. Granger, who had been standing silently in the corner, seemed intrigued by where Chuck was going with this. "Here's what I propose," Chuck continued, pacing slowly in front of the class. "Every one of you has a chance to carry on the legacy of heroes like Mr. Parker, not by fighting wars, but by living lives of courage, kindness, and integrity. You don't need medals or recognition to do that. All you need is heart." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now here's my challenge for you. Over the next week, I want each of you to find someone in your life, a family member, a neighbor, a friend, and ask them about their own stories. Maybe they served in the military, maybe they overcame hardship, or maybe they simply did something brave in everyday life. Whatever it is, listen carefully, and then share their story with the class." The idea sparked excitement among the students. Some leaned forward eagerly, already thinking about whom they might interview. Others whispered to their neighbors, brainstorming possibilities. Emily, however, looked at Chuck with wide eyes, clearly moved by the suggestion. "That's a great idea," Samuel chimed in, his voice warm and encouraging. "Stories are powerful. They connect us to our past, help us understand who we are, and inspire us to be better. Don't underestimate the impact of sharing someone's truth." Chuck smiled at Samuel, nodding in agreement. Then, turning back to the class, he added, "And here's the best part. If you put effort into this project, I'll come back next week to hear your presentations. How does that sound?" The room erupted into cheers, the energy palpable. For many of these kids, having Chuck Norris return was like a dream come true. But more than that, they felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just another school assignment. It was an opportunity to honor the people in their lives and keep their legacies alive. Mrs. Granger, watching the scene unfold, couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt mixed with admiration. She realized now how wrong she had been. Not only in dismissing Emily's claims, but also in failing to inspire her students the way Chuck and Samuel were doing right now. Determined to make amends, she stepped forward hesitantly. I'd like to help too, she said, her voice trembling, but sincere. If it's okay with everyone, I can guide the students through this project. We can turn it into something meaningful, something lasting. The class turned to look at her, surprised by her sudden change in attitude. Chuck studied her for a moment, then gave her a small, approving nod. That sounds like a good start, he said. But remember, teaching isn't about being perfect. It's about learning alongside your students and helping them grow. Keep that in mind moving forward. Mrs. Granger nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was clear that this experience had shaken her deeply, forcing her to confront her own biases and shortcomings. But instead of dwelling on her mistakes, she chose to channel her regret into action, a decision that earned her a glimmer of forgiveness from both her students and herself. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, the classroom buzzed with excitement. Students gathered around Emily and Samuel, peppering them with questions about the war and Samuel's experiences. Chuck stayed behind as well, patiently answering inquiries and sharing anecdotes from his own time in the Air Force. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, wonder, and newfound respect. Before leaving, Chuck pulled Emily aside for a private moment. Kneeling down to her level, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You handled yourself really well today, he told her, his voice soft but proud. Not everyone would have the courage to stand up for the truth like you did. Emily blushed, looking down at her shoes. I just didn't want anyone to think Grandpa was lying, she mumbled. He's always been my hero. Chuck smiled warmly. And he always will be, he said. But remember, being a hero isn't just about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about standing tall when others try to knock you down. You did that today, and I'm proud of you. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. She hugged Chuck tightly, overwhelmed by gratitude. When she finally pulled back, she glanced at her grandpa, who was still surrounded by curious students. Seeing him smile and laugh as he recounted tales from his youth made her heart swell with pride. Later that evening, as Emily sat at the kitchen table working on her project, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Her mom noticed the faraway look in her eyes and asked what was on her mind. It's just, today was so crazy, Emily admitted, smiling faintly. But in a good way. Everyone knows now that Grandpa's a real hero, and Chuck Norris even said he'll come back to hear our stories. Her mom chuckled, shaking her head in disbelief. Your grandpa always knew how special you were, she said, ruffling Emily's hair affectionately. Looks like the rest of the world is starting to catch on too. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Granger sat alone in her apartment, staring at the photo of Samuel Parker that Chuck had left behind. She traced the edges of the picture with trembling fingers, replaying the day's events in her mind. Never in her career had she faced such a humbling moment, or such a transformative one. As she vowed silently to become a better teacher, she realized that sometimes the greatest lessons come not from textbooks, but from the unexpected twists of real life. Back at home, Samuel settled into his favorite armchair, a cup of tea in hand. He gazed out the window, lost in thought. Though he had never sought fame or recognition for his actions during the war, today had reminded him of the importance of sharing his story, not for himself, but for future generations. Heroes may fade with time, but their legacies live on through those willing to remember. And as the sun set over the small Texas town, casting long shadows across the landscape, it was clear that something extraordinary had taken root in that classroom. A single act of courage had sparked a ripple effect, touching hearts and changing lives in ways no one could have predicted. The days following the unforgettable classroom incident passed quickly, but the impact of that day lingered. The entire school seemed to buzz with energy, as if a quiet storm had swept through and left behind something new, a renewed sense of purpose. Students whispered excitedly in the hallways about their upcoming presentations, sharing snippets of the stories they were uncovering. Teachers, too, couldn't help but notice the change. Even Mrs. Granger, who usually kept to herself during lunch breaks, found herself drawn into conversations with colleagues about how the project was shaping up. For Emily, life felt different in the best possible way. She walked taller now, her head held high, no longer afraid to speak up when someone doubted her or her grandpa's story. Her classmates treated her differently too, not with pity or awkwardness, but with genuine admiration. Some even asked if they could interview Samuel for their own projects, which made Emily beam with pride. It wasn't just about proving her grandpa was a hero anymore. It was about seeing how his legacy inspired others. Samuel, on the other hand, took all the attention in stride. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he understood its importance. Every evening he sat patiently while Emily peppered him with questions for her presentation. At first he hesitated, brushing off some details as unimportant. But Emily insisted, reminding him gently, "Grandpa, these are the things that make you who you are. People need to hear them." One night, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Emily pulled out an old box from under his bed, the one she'd mentioned in class. Inside were faded letters, medals wrapped carefully in cloth, and more photographs than she'd ever seen before. Samuel watched silently as she sifted through the treasures, his expression softening with each memory that surfaced. "You know," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I kept these not because I wanted to remember the war, but because I wanted to remember the people, the ones who didn't come home. They're the real reason I survived." Emily looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Then tell me about them," she urged softly. "Tell me so I can share their stories too." And so, Samuel began recounting tales he hadn't spoken of in years, stories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and loss. There was the young soldier who gave away his last ration to a starving child, knowing he might not survive without it. The medic who risked his life to save wounded comrades, only to fall himself. And the sergeant who sang songs late at night to lift spirits, his voice cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. Each story painted a vivid picture of humanity amid chaos, leaving Emily awestruck. By the time she finished writing her notes, she knew her presentation wouldn't just be about her grandpa. It would be about all the unsung heroes whose courage shaped history. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris kept his promise. True to his word, he returned to the school exactly 1 week later, this time accompanied by a local news crew. Word had spread about the inspiring project, and the community wanted to celebrate it. When Chuck walked into the classroom, the students erupted into applause, their faces lighting up with excitement. For many of them, this visit felt like the culmination of everything they'd worked toward. Mrs. Granger greeted Chuck nervously, but warmly, her earlier arrogance replaced by humility. She thanked him sincerely for stepping in when he did, admitting that his presence had been a turning point, not just for Emily, but for her as well. Chuck simply smiled and patted her shoulder. "We all make mistakes," he said kindly. "What matters is what we do after." As the presentations began, the room fell silent, the air charged with anticipation. Each student stood up, sharing the stories they had uncovered. One boy talked about his great-uncle, a firefighter who saved dozens of lives during a devastating wildfire. A girl recounted how her grandmother escaped poverty by working 3 jobs to put herself through college. Another student spoke about his dad, a paramedic who stayed calm under pressure to save accident victims. But when it was Emily's turn, the room seemed to hold its breath. Clutching her notes tightly, she stepped to the front of the class, her heart pounding. For a moment she froze, overwhelmed by the weight of what she was about to say. Then she glanced at her grandpa, seated proudly in the back row, and found her courage. "My grandpa isn't just a hero because of what he did in the war," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He's a hero because of who he is. A man who puts others first, who remembers those who can't speak for themselves, and who teaches us that bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared." She went on to share the stories Samuel had told her, weaving them into a narrative that brought both tears and smiles to the audience. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, louder and more heartfelt than ever before. Emily returned, To her seat, her cheeks flushed but her spirit soaring. Chuck stood up next, visibly moved by what he'd witnessed. "This is exactly why I came here," he said, addressing the class. "Heroes aren't just people in uniforms or capes. They're ordinary folks who rise to extraordinary challenges. Today you've honored them, and yourselves, by keeping their stories alive." Afterward, the celebration spilled out into the schoolyard, where families gathered to meet Chuck and hear more about the project. Parents hugged their children tightly, proud of the effort they'd put into their presentations. Teachers exchanged hugs and handshakes, marveling at how much the students had grown in such a short time. And Samuel, surrounded by admirers, accepted their gratitude with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all along. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the scene, it was clear that something profound had taken place. What had started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a movement, a reminder that truth, kindness, and courage have the power to transform lives. In the weeks that followed, the project continued to ripple outward. Local newspapers wrote articles about it, highlighting the students' efforts and the lessons they'd learned. Other schools reached out, asking how they could replicate the idea. Mrs. Granger, determined to make amends, became a vocal advocate for teaching empathy and resilience in the classroom. And Emily? She carried the experience with her always, a reminder that standing up for the truth, even when it's hard, can lead to something beautiful. The town would never forget that day, nor the man who walked into a classroom and changed everything. Chuck Norris may have left soon after, returning to his busy life, but his message remained. Heroes exist everywhere, and sometimes all it takes is believing in someone to help their light shine brightest. The weeks that followed the classroom project brought a wave of change to the small Texas town. What had started as a single moment of defiance and truth-telling grew into something much larger, a community-wide movement to honor unsung heroes and preserve their stories for future generations. The impact rippled far beyond the school walls, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. For Emily, life felt brighter and fuller than ever before. She carried herself with newfound confidence, knowing she had stood up for what was right and inspired others to do the same. Her classmates treated her not just as a peer, but as someone who had taught them an important lesson about courage and integrity. Even the teachers looked at her differently now, often stopping by to ask how her grandpa was doing or to thank her for sparking such a meaningful initiative. Samuel, too, found himself thrust into the spotlight, though he never sought it. Neighbors, parents, and even strangers approached him at the grocery store or on his daily walks, eager to hear more about his wartime experiences. At first, he tried to brush off the attention, insisting he was just doing his job. But eventually, he realized that sharing his story wasn't just about him. It was about keeping the memory of those who didn't come home alive. And so he began speaking at local events, libraries, and community gatherings, always reminding people that true heroism lies not in glory, but in service. Mrs. Granger underwent perhaps the most profound transformation of all. The incident in the classroom had shaken her deeply, forcing her to confront her own biases and shortcomings. Determined to make amends, she threw herself into teaching with a renewed sense of purpose. Gone was the rigid, skeptical woman who dismissed students' claims without listening. In her place stood a compassionate educator who encouraged curiosity, celebrated individuality, and fostered open dialogue in her classroom. She also took steps to ensure that moments like the one involving Emily would never happen again. With Chuck Norris's blessing, she helped establish a program called Voices of Valor, designed to give students a platform to share stories of courage and resilience from their own families and communities. The program quickly gained traction, spreading to other schools in the district and earning praise from parents and administrators alike. It became Mrs. Granger's legacy, a way to turn her mistake into something positive and lasting. Chuck Norris remained a guiding presence throughout it all. Though his visits to the school were rare due to his busy schedule, he stayed connected through letters and video calls, offering advice and encouragement whenever needed. His words carried weight, not because of his fame, but because of the sincerity behind them. He reminded everyone, students, teachers, and parents, That being a hero isn't about grand gestures or accolades. It's about showing kindness, standing up for others, and making choices that reflect your values. One evening, several months after the initial incident, the town held a special ceremony to honor the project and its participants. Families gathered in the school auditorium, which had been decorated with banners and photographs showcasing the students' work. Each presentation was displayed proudly on posters lining the walls, accompanied by heartfelt notes from the students, explaining why these stories mattered to them. Samuel sat in the front row alongside Emily, beaming with pride as he watched the fruits of everyone's labor unfold. When it came time for speeches, Chuck Norris took the stage once again, this time greeted by thunderous applause. He smiled warmly, tipping his cowboy hat to the crowd before addressing them. "I've traveled all over the world," he began, his voice steady and sincere, "and I've met countless people from all walks of life. But few have touched my heart the way this community has. You've shown me and each other that the power to inspire lies within us all. It doesn't take extraordinary circumstances to be a hero. Sometimes it's simply about choosing to care." He went on to commend the students for their hard work and creativity, singling out Emily for her bravery and standing up for her grandpa. "You remind us all," he said, looking directly at her, "that the truth is worth fighting for. Never forget that." As the ceremony drew to a close, Samuel stood up to deliver a few words of his own. Leaning heavily on his cane, he made his way to the microphone, pausing briefly to collect his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with emotion. "Heroes aren't defined by medals or titles," he said. "They're defined by the love they show, the sacrifices they make, and the lives they touch. Tonight, we celebrate not just the stories of those who came before us, but the spirit of those here today, the students, the teachers, the parents, who are carrying those legacies forward. Thank you for letting me be part of this journey." By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As Samuel returned to his seat, Emily hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by gratitude and pride. Around them, families embraced. Teachers exchanged hugs, and students laughed and cheered, united by the shared experience of having learned something truly valuable. In the days and weeks that followed, the effects of the project continued to spread. Local newspapers published articles highlighting the students' efforts, while social media buzzed with photos and videos from the ceremony. Other schools across the state reached out, asking how they could implement similar programs in their own communities. The idea of honoring everyday heroes caught fire, igniting conversations about the importance of storytelling and remembrance. But perhaps the greatest testament to the project's success was the change it sparked within the individuals involved. Students who had once been shy or unsure of themselves discovered newfound confidence. Teachers like Mrs. Granger embraced fresh perspectives, proving that growth is possible at any age. And families, inspired by the stories shared, began digging deeper into their own histories, uncovering tales of courage and resilience they hadn't known existed. For Emily, the experience left an indelible mark. She learned that standing up for the truth wasn't just about defending her grandpa. It was about creating space for others to share their truths too. She saw firsthand the ripple effect of courage, how one act of defiance could lead to something beautiful and transformative. And as she walked home with Samuel after the ceremony, hand in hand under the starlit sky, she knew one thing for certain. Heroes may fade with time, but their legacies live on through those willing to remember. Small Texas town had changed forever, and so had the hearts of everyone who called it home.